There are cars that win races. There are cars that break records. And then once in a very long while, there is a car that makes the people in charge of the entire sport genuinely afraid. Not nervous, not uncomfortable, afraid. The kind of fear that makes powerful organizations do things they would never openly admit to. The kind of fear that rewrites rulebooks overnight and ends careers without explanation. The Chevy Vega that Bill Jenkins built was that kind of car. And what the NHRA did about it is one of the most important and most deliberately forgotten stories in the entire history of American drag racing. My name is David, and if you have been watching this channel for any length of time, you already know that we do not tell the comfortable version of these stories. We tell the real version, and the real version of what happened between Bill Jenkins, his Vega, and the NHRA is something that every serious drag racing fan deserves to hear in full. Because this is not just about one car. This is about what happens when one man gets so good at something that the system, built to govern that thing, starts to crack under the pressure of his excellence. Stay with me, because we are starting from the very beginning. Before we talk about the car, we have to talk about the man, because you cannot understand what the Vega meant without understanding who Bill Jenkins was, and what he represented in the world of drag racing at that particular moment in history. Bill Jenkins was not a factory driver. He was not a corporate-sponsored showpiece who showed up at events in a team transporter with a crew of 20 people behind him. He was an independent, a thinker, a builder who operated on the principle that deep understanding of the fundamentals would always beat bigger budgets and better connections. And for the better part of a decade, he proved it over and over again on tracks across America. Jenkins grew up with engines the way some people grow up with books, absorbing everything, questioning everything, never satisfied with the accepted explanation for why something worked the way it did. By the time he was competing seriously in drag racing, he had already developed a reputation as one of the most technically sophisticated engine builders in the sport. Not the most famous, not the most promoted, but among the people who actually understood what was happening under the hood. Jenkins was in a category by himself. What made him genuinely different was the way he approached problems. Most builders of his era worked from experience and instinct. They knew what had worked before, and they built on it. Jenkins worked from first principles. He wanted to understand the physics of what was happening inside the engine at every point in the combustion cycle, not approximately, not generally, but precisely. He read engineering literature. He corresponded with academics. He ran tests that other builders considered a waste of time because the answers seemed obvious to them. To Jenkins, nothing was obvious until it was proven. And that discipline, that refusal to assume, is what allowed him to find things that everyone else had missed. His nickname was Grumpy, and if you ever saw him at a track, you understood immediately why. He was not there to smile for cameras or sign autographs or make friends in the paddock. He was there to win. He had a directness about him, a willingness to say exactly what he thought about the technical choices other builders were making that did not always make him popular. But it made him respected. Even the people who found him difficult to deal with acknowledged that when Jenkins said something about an engine, you listened, because he had earned that. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, Jenkins had already accumulated a competitive record that put him among the elite of pro stock drag racing. Multiple national event wins, consistent performance at the highest level of the class, a track record that spoke entirely for itself. And then he decided to build the Vega. And everything changed. Why the Vega? The choice of the Chevrolet Vega as his competition platform was itself a statement. In the early 1970s, the Vega was not a car that serious people took seriously. It was a small economy car, lightweight, modest, designed for practicality rather than performance. In a sport that celebrated muscle cars and big block engines, choosing a Vega was the kind of decision that invited mockery. Jenkins did not care about the mockery. He cared about the physics. What Jenkins understood, and what most of his contemporaries had not yet fully worked through, was that in pro-stock drag racing, weight was the enemy. Power mattered enormously, obviously, but power relative to weight was what actually determined elapsed time. And the Vega, stripped down and prepared for competition, offered a weight advantage over the larger muscle car platforms that was significant enough to change the entire performance equation. You did not need to build more power than a bigger car if you were carrying hundreds of pounds less. You needed to build enough power to make the weight advantage decisive. and Jenkins was confident with good reason that he could do exactly that. The other factor was aerodynamics. The Vega's smaller frontal area meant less aerodynamic drag at the speeds a pro stock car reaches in the lights. Again, not a dramatic factor in isolation, but combined with the weight advantage, it contributed to a package that Jenkins calculated would be genuinely competitive, even against cars with larger displacement engines. This was systems thinking applied to drag racing, not looking at one variable in isolation, but understanding how multiple variables interacted to produce a final result. That kind of thinking was Jenkins' competitive advantage as much as any specific technical choice he made. He began the Vega build with the same methodical patience that had characterized everything he had done before. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was approximated. Every component was evaluated against the specific demands of the application. And the engine which would ultimately be the center of everything that followed was approached with a level of detail and precision that reflected 15 years of accumulated knowledge applied to a single purpose. The engine Jenkins built for the Vega was, on paper, a legal pro stock engine. It met the displacement requirements. It used approved components. It did not violate any specific rule that existed at the time it was built. But what Jenkins had done with those legal components, the depth of preparation and the precision of execution, put it in a completely different performance category from anything else running in the class. The cylinder head work was the foundation of everything. Jenkins had spent years developing his understanding of airflow through cylinder heads, studying port geometry, valve placement, combustion chamber shape, and the heads on the Vega engine reflected that accumulated knowledge in every detail. The porting was not aggressive in the way that most people understood aggressive porting. It was not about making the openings as large as possible. It was about shaping the airflow path to produce the most efficient possible. Charge at the specific RPM range the engine needed to operate in during a drag race run. The difference in approach produced dramatically different results. The valve train was prepared to a standard that most engine shops of that era could not match. Valves, springs, retainers, every component selected and prepared to minimize weight and maximize reliability at the operating speeds the engine would see. Rocker geometry was carefully set to ensure that the valve motion followed exactly the profile Jenkins intended at every point in the rev range. These are the kinds of details that produce small individual gains, but when every small gain is captured and nothing is left on the table, the cumulative result is an engine that outperforms its apparent specifications by a margin that seems impossible until you understand how it was achieved. The carburation setup was another area where Jenkins' understanding ran deeper than the competition. Fuel delivery at the specific flow rates and mixture ratios that produced maximum power in this engine under the temperature and ascension pressure conditions of an actual race run was something he had worked out through testing and calculation rather than convention. The result was an engine that delivered its power consistently, run after run, without the variation that plagued competitors who had not done the same depth of preparation work. When the engine was installed in the Vega and the car made its first full test passes, the data confirmed what Jenkins had calculated. The package was fast, genuinely, significantly, undeniably fast. Fast enough that anyone who understood pro stock performance at the national level would immediately recognize that something unusual had been built. And fast enough that when it started appearing at national events, the reaction from the competition and from the NHRA was swift, pointed, and ultimately revealing about how the organization handled threats to its established order. The first time the Jenkins Vega appeared at a national event, it was impossible to ignore. The car was visually distinctive, smaller, lower, leaner than the muscle car platforms that dominated pro stock at the time. In the staging lanes, it looked almost out of place. Competitors who saw it for the first time allowed themselves a private moment of dismissal. A Vega. In pro stock. Against cars with serious cubic inches and serious backing. It seemed like a curiosity at best. Then it ran. And the dismissal evaporated immediately. The elapsed time that came back from the first competitive pass was not just competitive, it was dominant. The combination of the weight advantage, the aerodynamic profile, and the extraordinary engine preparation Jenkins had put into the build produced performance numbers that put it at or near the top of the class from its very first appearance. The competitors who had smiled in the staging lanes were not smiling anymore. Jenkins drove the car with the same methodical precision that characterized everything he did. He was not a dramatic driver. He did not make the run look spectacular. He simply executed clean launch, consistent shift points, smooth pass, and the time slip told the story more eloquently than any driving theatrics could have. The car worked exactly the way he had designed it to work, and in national pro stock competition. At that level, against that field, it worked better than anything else on the property. The win streak that followed was not unbroken. No win streak in professional drag racing ever is, because variables beyond any builder's control are always present. But the consistency of the Vega's performance across multiple national events established beyond any reasonable argument that this was the class of the field. When it ran clean, it won. And when it did not win, the reasons were the random mechanical variables that affect every competitor equally, not a performance deficit. On pure performance, the Jenkins Vega had separated itself from the competition in a way that was becoming very difficult for the NHRA to explain away. Organizations like the NHRA do not like surprises. They particularly do not like surprises that come from outside the established structure, from independent builders working without factory support, without corporate backing, without the kind of institutional relationships that make an organization comfortable with a competitor's success. Bill Jenkins was exactly that kind of surprise. He had built something exceptional on his own terms, and its success was making the organization's established competitors, the factory-backed teams with the deep relationships and the significant investments, look ordinary. The scrutiny began almost immediately. Teardowns after runs, detailed inspections before events. The kind of attention that is technically within the organization's rights to apply, but that, when applied selectively and persistently to one competitor while others receive routine treatment, communicates something beyond procedural diligence. Jenkins submitted to every inspection. He answered every question. He provided documentation when documentation was requested. He operated, as he always had, with the transparency of a man who had built something legitimate and had no reason to behave otherwise. The inspections found nothing actionable. The car was legal. The engine was legal. Every component that was checked against the rulebook met the rulebook's requirements. This should have been the end of the scrutiny. In a straightforward, rules-based competition environment, it would have been. You inspect, you find nothing wrong, you move on. But the NHRA's response to finding nothing wrong was not to move on. It was to look harder. And when looking harder still produced no violation, to begin the process of considering whether the rules themselves needed to change. This is the moment where the story shifts from a story about a great racing car to a story about institutional power. Because what followed was not a response to rule breaking. It was a response to excellence. The Vega had not done anything wrong. Jenkins had not done anything wrong. But the car's performance was disrupting the established hierarchy of pro stock, the hierarchy that the NHRA had a TRA, had a TO. Significant interest in maintaining, and the organization was not prepared to allow that disruption to continue indefinitely. The specific regulatory changes that affected the Jenkins Vega came through the same mechanism that governing bodies always use when they want to accomplish something without appearing to target a specific competitor: the technical bulletin, routine, administrative, buried in language precise enough to affect exactly the thing it was aimed at while appearing general enough to suggest broad applicability. The changes that came targeted the weight classifications and the specific engine configurations that made the Vega package work. Weight breaks, the allowances given to lighter cars to maintain competitive balance, were adjusted in ways that neutralized the advantage Jenkins had built his entire concept around. The careful, calculated weight differential that the Vega's platform provided the advantage that Jenkins had identified before anyone else as the key to making a small car competitive against larger displacement machines was effectively legislated away. Jenkins understood exactly what was happening. He had seen how organizations operated. He was not naive about the relationship between institutional power and competitive outcomes in professional motorsport. But understanding what was happening did not make it any less wrong. He had built his car around the rules as they existed. He had identified a legitimate competitive advantage within those rules and exploited it with extraordinary skill and preparation. The fact that his exploitation of that advantage was too successful, that it worked better than the organization was comfortable with, did not make it illegitimate. It made it exceptional. And exceptional, in this context, was the problem. He pushed back through the appropriate channels. He made his arguments. He presented his case with the same methodical precision that he brought to everything else. And the organization heard him out and did what organizations do when they have already made their decision. They went ahead with the decision. The rules changed, the advantage evaporated, and the specific combination of factors that had made the Jenkins Vega the most dominant car in pro stock was, by regulatory action, eliminated. The impact of what happened with the Jenkins Vega extended well beyond Bill Jenkins himself. It sent a message to every independent builder in pro stock and in drag racing more broadly about the limits of independent innovation within a sanctioned competition structure. The message was not subtle. If you build something so good that it embarrasses the established competitors and disrupts the hierarchy, the organization depends on the organization will respond. Not necessarily fairly, not necessarily transparently, but effectively. This had consequences for the sport that played out over years and decades. The most creative, most independent technical minds in drag racing learned to calibrate their ambitions against what the organizational structure would tolerate. Not how fast can I build this car, but how fast can I build this car before the rules change? That is a fundamentally different question, and answering it requires a fundamentally different approach, one that prioritizes political navigation over pure technical excellence. That is not good for any sport. It is not good for the competitors, for the fans, or for the long-term technical development of the machines that give the sport its identity. Jenkins himself continued to compete and continued to achieve at a high level for years after the Vega controversy. He was too good and too experienced to be eliminated from the sport by a regulatory setback. But the specific window that the Vega had opened the possibility of a lightweight, aerodynamically efficient platform carrying a supremely prepared engine to pro stock dominance was closed. Deliberately closed, by people who understood exactly what they were closing and why. Bill Jenkins' place in drag racing history is secure not because the NHRA gave it to him, but because the results are on record and the people who were there remember what they saw. He won national events. He developed technical innovations that influenced engine building across the sport for decades. He proved, repeatedly and definitively, that deep knowledge and disciplined preparation could compete with and beat factory programs that had vastly greater resources. That is a legacy that no regulatory action can erase. But the Vega story adds a dimension to that legacy that matters. It demonstrates not just how good Jenkins was, but how threatening that level of independent excellence was to the established order. The NHRA did not fear many competitors. They feared Bill Jenkins enough to change their rulebook. And that fear, that institutional response to one man's technical brilliance, tells you more about how exceptional he truly was than any win total or elapsed time record ever could. The men who watched him work, who saw what he built and understood what it meant, have been telling this story in garages and at tracks for 50 years, because it is a story worth telling, about what is possible when someone refuses to accept the conventional limits of what everyone else thinks can be done, and about what happens when that refusal produces results that make the powerful uncomfortable. I want to leave you with one thought before you go. Bill Jenkins did not build the Vega to make a political statement. He built it to win. He identified an advantage within the rules, applied everything he knew to maximize that advantage, and went racing. That is exactly what competitors are supposed to do. The fact that he did it better than anyone else, better than the factory teams, better than the better-funded operations, better than everyone the organization had a relationship with and a stake in, was not his failure. It was his achievement. And the way it was handled says everything about the difference between an organization that serves its sport and one that has started to serve itself. Now, I want to hear from you. If you watched pro stock in that era, if you saw the Vega run, if you knew someone who was there, drop it in the comments right now. Your memories are part of this history, and they belong in the record. And if you think Jenkins deserved better than what he got from the NHRA, type Grumpy in the comments. Let the algorithm know this story still matters. Hit subscribe if you want the next one, because we are just getting started on the cars the NHRA wished would disappear. I will see you in the next video.